On Halloween night of 2011, in the sleepy Canadian city of Armstrong, British Columbia, 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest is full of nostalgic excitement. A recent graduate of the local Pleasant Valley High School in June of that same year, Taylor had spent the summer reflecting on the nature of growing up and the passage of time. She had also recently learned to drive, finishing her lessons and passing the relevant examinations, and was about to receive her Canadian novice driver N plates. So we can understand why she might be overwhelmed with anxieties about officially becoming an adult, something we all contemplate at some point in our youth. She and her friends had ceased trick-or-treating for the previous few years, instead opting for more mature pursuits. But that year in particular, it had hit them that it was something they might never be able to do as friends ever again. They reminisced of the costumes they used to wear, the huge candy hauls they used to bring home, and the general sense of excitement and mischief that was always in the air on those Halloween evenings. Then together, they decided on one last trick-or-treating hurrah, committing to donning some spooky costumes one final time, before they would doubtlessly be turned away by homeowners as far too old for such childish activity. During the previous year, Taylor had been enamored with the much-loved AMC drama The Walking Dead. Millions of North Americans had been tuning in, week out, to keep up with the terrifying stories of Rick Grimes and his fellow survivors, and Taylor was no different. So when it came to her choice of costume that year, like countless other trick-or-treaters, Taylor opted for the slightly derivative but highly effective choice of zombie. All it took was a little pale makeup, some fake blood, and an old torn purple blouse. Then Taylor was ready to roll. She and her gang of trick-or-treating friends had agreed to congregate at one of their parents' houses before heading out into the night, and before she left for the short walk, Taylor called her friend to let her know she was on her way at about 5:45 p.m., intending to use the usual walking route down Pleasant Valley Road. Taylor's boyfriend at the time, a young man named Colton, was not attending that evening's trick-or-treating, but was still in touch with her regularly. Taylor had promised to split her night's candy haul with him, a move characteristically generous of a young woman who had a reputation for being fun-loving and kind. But when she reached the intersection of Colony Avenue, Taylor decided to use a quiet shortcut the many locals used which crossed some train tracks. Taylor and her friends continued to exchange texts with her during the 10 minutes or so that followed, but suddenly, Taylor stopped replying. This might not usually be any cause to raise the alarm, but Taylor was a prolific texter and was generally known to reply with near-perfect spelling within mere seconds, unless she was asleep. Taylor's friends immediately began to worry. The last message Taylor had sent was to her boyfriend Colton at around 6:02 p.m. It simply read, "being creeped." But Taylor had misspelled the word creeped with 2 R's and only 1 E in the middle, as if it was a rushed message from someone who was very, very frightened. It was only a short walk between their 2 houses, a journey that should have been quick and uncomplicated, but when Taylor failed to arrive and Colton shared the frightening final text with them, her friends assumed the worst. Maybe it was the sinister nature of the date in question. Maybe it was an extrasensory perception that something was wrong. Regardless, Taylor's friends raised the alarm and immediately began to search the route between their homes for any sign of her. Around 2 hours later, while searching near some train tracks that ran near their homes, Taylor's friends found a cell phone lying in the dirt. Wondering just who might have managed to lose such an expensive item, they picked it up and examined it. It was Taylor's. In a panic, they continued their search, calling Taylor's name over and over along the route they knew she would have taken. They stopped shouting out her name only at around 8:45 p.m. when they saw a crumpled body lying in a patch of grass about 10 feet away from the train tracks. Even in the dark October evening, they recognized the shape of their friend almost immediately, but were horrified at the grisly sight that greeted them upon closer inspection. Taylor was lying face down in the long grass, mumbling incoherently and struggling to breathe. There was a heavy discoloration around her neck, as well as burst blood vessels in her eyes from where someone had attempted to strangle her. But it was the wounds to her head that caused the most alarm. Taylor's skull had been almost entirely crushed with repeated blows from some blunt object. Her hair was matted with drying blood and cranial fluid. She also had cuts on her lips, a large gash on her forehead, and somehow had bruising on the inside of her mouth. Taylor also had a large bruise on her shoulder consistent with the kind of injuries someone might have if they're thrown to the ground and stomped on. She also had bruising on her arms and hands, along with 2 broken fingers, wounds that are common when a person attempts to defend themselves from a brutal and overpowering attacker. Her horrified companions struggled to discern where her zombie makeup ended and her true injuries began. Police had been notified of her disappearance long before her body was found, but now an ambulance crew rushed to arrive on scene, transporting Taylor to a nearby hospital for treatment. Taylor's mother, Marie, accompanied her in the ambulance, reportedly repeating to her bloodied daughter over and over again, "Fight it. You're going to make it. Taylor, survive." Paramedics managed to stabilize her condition while on the way to the Jubilee Hospital, 20 minutes south of the city of Vernon. There, ER doctor Michael Concannon fought to save her life, but found that her pupils were large and unresponsive, a common symptom of massive brain injury. A subsequent CAT scan confirmed that things were not looking good for young Taylor. Taylor was placed on an artificial breathing machine in the hopes that it might buy doctors more time to save her life, but by the next morning, their valiant efforts had proved to be in vain. Taylor died as a result of a hemorrhage owed to the massive blunt force trauma she'd suffered as a result of the violent attack she'd been subjected to. A subsequent forensic examination found that Taylor's fingernails had skin and blood tissues trapped under them, evidence that she had made a brave attempt at fighting off her attacker. Although she might have passed on as a result of the horrific wounds she had suffered, the attempts that she had made to save her own life, scratching and tearing at her mystery assailant's flesh, were about to contribute to bringing them to justice. Along with the substance trapped under them, her nails were clipped and bagged as evidence by a forensically trained nurse. With a sizable amount of DNA evidence collected, all the police had to do was conduct a thorough enough investigation. Once they'd bagged their man, the DNA evidence would do the rest and secure a lengthy conviction for whichever predatory monster committed such a heinous act of violence. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were hard at work with their investigation when Taylor's obituary was published on the Vernon Morning Star's website. Taylor had not yet decided on a career path, the obituary read, but doubtless she would have made us all proud, whatever she would have chosen. We can only imagine the raw grief the small community felt at such a sudden passing, compounded by the fact that her life had been taken away in such a cruel and callous attack. Taylor's funeral was held on the evening of November the 7th, 2011, at Hassan Memorial Arena. Her murder had rocked the small town she once called home, so there were many in attendance who wished to pay their respects. But there was more than just a sense of love and loss in the air that evening. Many people wondered just who exactly in their community was responsible for her death, if the person was known to one of their number, or even if they were actually present. The RCMP began their investigation by canvassing the houses surrounding the place where Taylor's body was found. They discovered that people actually had heard screaming around the time the attack was thought to have taken place. One woman in particular was checking on her Halloween decorations when she had heard 2 distinctly female screams coming from the direction of the train tracks. But tragically, the woman simply put the scream down to lively Halloween antics from local youths. One can only imagine how haunted this lady will have been during the revelation that what she was hearing was far more than just youthful exuberance, but the sounds of an actual murder taking place. The RCMP also released images of Taylor wearing her Halloween costume to the public, in hopes that somebody who recognized her might come forward with information regarding anyone who may have been acting suspicious in the same area. They also set up a roadblock near the site of the murder, stopping any cars that passed in order to question them and potentially collect a few witness statements. They then held a press conference on November 3, 2011, in order to update the local and national media on the progress of their investigation. Both Taylor's loved ones and the gathered press were both disappointed to hear that there was no suspects in the case, but the RCMP assured them that every lead available would be followed up so that they might deliver swift justice to those that demanded it. However, they did not release any details on the nature of the murder or Taylor's cause of death, the reason being that only a handful of people knew of such information, one of whom was the person responsible for Taylor's death. Clued into the fact that investigators might be hot on their tail, the murderer could flee the area or even the country and might never face justice for their dreadful crimes. However, some bizarre events hampered the investigative process. Canadian police actually received a letter, the author of which claimed to be Taylor's murderer. But there was little in the letter's contents that indicated that they had any intimate knowledge regarding the details of the crime, and it was dismissed as hoax correspondence. It is an absolute mystery to me as to why anyone would wish to claim responsibility for such a killing, and only evidences the fact that there are some truly sick and disturbed people in the world, and perhaps the most concerning thing is that these kinds of things happen far more than we'd care to believe. In the last week of November 2011, another RCMP press conference was held, one in which some shocking new information came to light. It was announced that, thanks to the DNA pulled from under Taylor's fingernails, a genetic profile had been put together of the person thought to be responsible for her death. Police confirmed that the perpetrator was male, and his DNA matched that which was taken from the investigation following an unsolved assault against a massage parlor escort in the same geographical area, which took place around 2005. The man's stored DNA had no name attached to it, their identity remained a mystery, but regardless, a pattern was starting to emerge, an image of a predator who targeted lone women in order to get indecent gratification. And given the nature of the crimes committed, there were likely dozens of unreported incidents that stem from this man's reckless and predacious behavior. However, there was something of a breakthrough, one that was thoroughly welcomed by Taylor's friends and family. Thanks to witness statements taken after the 2005 assault, police now had a rough physical description of the offender, and a sketch artist was asked to draw a composite image based on this information. He was apparently a Caucasian male, with a slightly darker skin tone than most Canadians, approximately 19 to 20 years of age in 2005, which would obviously make him 25 to 26 at the time of Taylor's murder. He had dark eyes, most likely brown, and had short, dark hair and thick eyebrows, with an estimated height of 5'8 to 5'10. He was also said to possess a rather stocky build, but was apparently not athletic or muscular. He was also believed to be native to the area, with intimate enough knowledge of the surrounding area to be able to make a quick escape once he realized Taylor was not the easy target he had expected her to be. Police also released a brief psychological profile, suspecting him to be quick to anger and highly emotionally unstable. After all, he had essentially thrown a temper tantrum when he couldn't get what he wanted, one that manifested itself incredibly violently. Since he couldn't have Taylor, no one would. In light of this, police appealed to the general public to come forward with any information regarding anyone who had experienced conflict or emotional pressure in the days before Halloween, including things like financial misfortune or trouble in a romantic relationship. They also asked anyone who had noticed a friend, relative, or neighbor show up with visible scratches on their face, neck, or arms to come forward for obvious reasons, or for information regarding anyone who made a sudden departure from the Armstrong area in the days following the attack. After the press conference, information poured in from almost 1,300 individuals who claimed to have pertinent information. Given that the population of the area surrounding Armstrong was about 10,000 people, that's a huge percentage of people that stepped up to try to help out with the investigation, speaking to the impact the murder had on such a close-knit community. And speaking of the impact the murder had, there was a pervasive sense of fear in Armstrong, given that the killer was basically still on the loose. In a community that spent rather a lot of time walking from place to place, foot traffic dropped off to almost nothing, and those that did walk places did so in groups. What was evident was that Taylor's murder was most certainly not the first time her killer had acted out, and it was more than likely that it was only a matter of time before he did so again. In December of 2011, The RCNP task force set up to investigate Taylor's murder traveled in force to Cherryville, British Columbia. There had been over 30 reports of a man residing there fitting the exact physical description they shared with the public during the last press conference, a man by the name of Matthew Stephen Forster. Not only did Forster fit the physical profile, but he was known to be somewhat erratic and over-emotional. On top of that, Forster had fled his rented apartment in a hurry just a few days after Taylor's murder. His landlord confirmed that Forster had asked for the damaged deposit back, but abandoned the request once he had learned that it would take a few days to get cashed, and left all of his belongings behind in the apartment. Forster's father later came and collected said belongings, and CCTV footage shows him acting extremely skittishly as he did so, almost as if he knew why his son had fled in such a hurry. Forster Sr. was later contacted by RCMP and questioned as to why his son had to leave the area so quickly. He replied that his son had secured a high-paying job at some oil field up in the north of the country, but had to leave quickly since the job offer was at extremely short notice. But Forster Sr.'s word wasn't taken as gospel by the police, since he himself had a criminal history that stretched all the way back to 1969, when he was arrested for stealing a car. There were other convictions for possession of controlled substances as well as escaping custody. Needless to say, Matthew Forster became the #1 suspect in Taylor's murder. Not only was his alibi proving to be somewhat shaky, but other evidence soon came to light that he was definitely worthy of investigation. A search warrant for the Forsters' cell phone records dating back to Halloween was issued, and the cell carrier that he was a customer of provided the relevant information to the police. Unsurprisingly, cell tower records showed that he was indeed in the area of Pleasant Valley Road on the night of the murder. Although we have no idea how the RCMP managed to get hold of Forster's DNA material, an analysis showed that it was a dead match for the DNA found under Taylor's fingernails, as well as the DNA gleaned from the 2005 indecent assault. They had their man, but where exactly was he hiding? The key to that was his father. Forster Sr. was hiding something that was painfully obvious to RCMP investigators, but they never could have guessed how heavily he was involved in his son's attempt to avoid justice. Not long after Matthew Forster was named as the main suspect, a man came forward claiming that Matthew's father had paid $500 Canadian for a bunch of his personal IDs, obviously so that he could forge a fake identity for his murderous son, promising he would return the IDs after a few months. Police then commenced to tap Forster Sr.'s cell phone, only to discover that he was indeed in contact with his fugitive son and was working on obtaining yet another fraudulent identity for Matthew so that he might seal his escape from justice for good. In late March of 2012, police were listening into a phone call between Matthew and his father when they finally let slip about his current location. Matthew had managed to secure a fairly well-paying job at a glass factory in Collingwood, Ontario, using the fraudulent documents provided by his father. On the phone call in question, he even bragged about his new photo ID provided by his employer, boasting that it would only increase his chances of getting off scot-free for the murder of an innocent young woman. Ironically, it was this phone call that Forster Sr. advised his son to stop using the cell phone he had been provided, as he had a bad feeling their calls may be being tapped. Police knew this was the time to strike, moving in to arrest Matthew Forster on charges of first-degree murder. They also took Forster Sr. into custody on charges of aiding and abetting a wanted fugitive. It was while in custody that Forster Sr. boasted to another prisoner about how he tried to help his son escape justice. There was just one problem with that, though, as the prisoner in question happened to not be a prisoner at all, but an undercover cop. Matthew Forster was immediately extradited back to British Columbia after his arrest, so that he could be charged with the murder of Taylor Van Diest. His initial police interview went on for hours and hours until finally, in the face of overwhelming evidence of his guilt, he confessed to Taylor's murder. A homicide detective asked Forster to look him in the eye before asking, "Do you feel bad for killing Taylor?" "Yes," Forster simply replied. He went on to say that he felt sick about what he had done, and admitted to having some serious anger issues as well as problems with indecent desires. Forster continued his confessions by admitting that he had driven into Armstrong on the afternoon of October 31st with the intent to find a young woman to assault, and for this, his charge was upgraded from second-degree murder to first. According to his confession, after he found Taylor walking near the railroad tracks, he tried to stop and talk to her for a few minutes, but once he realized they were alone, pushed her to the ground and told her to keep quiet. When she didn't comply with his demands, Forster admitted that he just freaked out. But the fact that he admitted choking Taylor with a shoelace, one the prosecutors argue he had on him for the express purpose of tying someone up, showed a distinct premeditation to his actions. In March of 2014, Forster finally stood trial for the crimes he had committed. After a few weeks of harrowing testimony from Taylor's friends and family, Matthew Stephen Forster was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Taylor's mother and father told the courtroom that they would never have full closure when it came to their daughter's untimely passing, but were grateful that justice had finally been served. "We're sad that we'll never be able to bring her back, but we're also happy that Animal is going to be off the streets," Taylor's mother told reporters at a press conference following the trial. Matthew's father also received a prison sentence for his part in aiding his son's attempts to escape justice, but with a sentence of just 3 years, some felt that he too had, to some degree, escaped justice. Since then, Halloween has become a night when Armstrong residents remember the bright shining light that Taylor Van Diest brought into the lives of all that knew her, a time when they try to forget the occasion when the scariest night of the year was made all the more terrifying by a dangerous and very real monster. Early on Halloween morning of 1981, Sister Tadea Benz was asleep in her bedroom at the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas. The 76-year-old nun had resided at the convent for most of her life, and it had been many, many years since the sister made a permanent commitment to God by pronouncing perpetual vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. On an average morning, Sister Tadea would awake at 5 a.m. sharp, fetch herself some coffee, and then visit with the convent's cat, Chloe. At 6:30, she would then walk down on the on-site chapel to attend morning prayer according to the Liturgy of the Hours, which was one of Sister Tadea's most favorite prayers. She believed that although they were divided by continents and time zones, the structure provided by the Liturgy of the Hours was something that helped nuns of all different cultures feel part of the wider network of faith. But on the morning of October 31st, Sister Angela Martinez, one of Sister Tadea's closest friends, noticed that she was not in attendance. This was obviously unusual. Despite her advanced age, Tadea never failed to miss a single morning service. "I missed her and was concerned because she seldom missed chapel," Sister Angela later said. So at around 7:30 a.m., as soon as morning service had finished, a handful of nuns gathered together and walked over to Sister Tadea's bedroom in order to check up on her. When they arrived, they found that the door to Sister Tadea's convent room was closed. "It was very much unusual to see that door was closed," Sister Angela added, because Tadea was hard of hearing and always left her door ajar to hear the morning buzzer. But when they opened the door, they were completely unprepared for what they found. On the floor of her bedroom, Sister Tadea lay nude and alone, with her arms outstretched by her sides and clotting blood surrounding her uncovered head. One of the nuns rushed over to revive her, but her body was cold. They checked her pulse, but there was none. Sister Tadea Benz was dead. To all observers, it appeared that Tadea had risen at her usual time, only to take a nasty fall which resulted in a traumatic head injury. It was heartbreakingly unexpected. The sister had not appeared unwell or weak in the days prior to her death, but the sisters took her passing in their stride. Tadea had led a good life and had dedicated herself to Christ. They had no doubt that she now resided in heaven at God's right hand. Sister Angela was in complete shock, The grief was almost overwhelming, and she could not bring herself to be around her late friend's body any further. So she enlisted the help of 4 other nuns who promptly went about wrapping Sister Taddea in a sheet before diligently cleaning up the spots of blood from the otherwise pristine bedroom floor. Once the work was completed, the nuns simply left their deceased sister in peace and went about planning her funeral arrangements. But later in the day, a Sister Florentine expressed her desire to visit Taddea's bedroom, where her body still lay, in order to pay her final respects to her departed sister. And it was while sitting near the body, praying that her soul would be lovingly received by the God she had incessantly worshipped for most of her adult life, that Florentine noticed something that would come to cause shockwaves among the pious community of the St. Francis convent. One of Taddea's bedroom windows had been broken. How this went unnoticed by the previous visitors of the room is something of a mystery, but there is every chance that since the nuns were so absorbed by their sister's passing and the morbid sight that greeted their entry, that they simply failed to observe such an unusual detail. Whatever the reason, the decision was made to call the police and inform them of a potential break-in. When deputies from the Amarillo Sheriff's Department arrived at the convent, Sister Taddea's body had been removed from her bedroom and driven to a local funeral home, so their investigation focused solely on the possibility of a break-in. It was only when one of the deputies overheard a conversation among the nuns regarding Taddea's passing that they became aware that a death had occurred. Eager to rule out foul play, a deputy asked to briefly examine her body and quickly discovered bruising around the dead nun's neck. Sister Florentine, like the other nuns who discovered her lifeless body, had taken it for granted that Taddea had died a natural death, and the revelation that she had in fact been murdered caused an outpouring of shock and horror among the convent's occupants. But the truth surrounding her death would only become more horrifying after sheriff's deputies transported Sister Taddea's body to a nearby mortician for further examination. A nun being strangled to death in the middle of the night was appalling and disturbing on its own, but the coroner who performed the post-mortem on Taddea's corpse discovered something even more atrocious. Before her life had been snuffed out by what would have to be someone of unspeakable evil, she had been indecently assaulted. Sister Taddea's bedroom was officially declared a crime scene, and forensic investigators were called in to gather evidence. They gathered up Taddea's bed linens and nightclothes to analyze them for bodily fluids, and it was during this process that police discovered a large steak knife that had been hidden under her bed. This had been used to cut away the screen on her window, but it was confirmed that the cause of death were not stab wounds or loss of blood, but asphyxiation by manual strangulation. Police were able to lift fingerprints from the handle of the knife, as well as from the bed's headboard, which had apparently been used for leverage by the murderer as he assaulted the 76-year-old nun as she slept. When deputies moved in to question those who lived in the homes neighboring the convent, they discovered that 1 or 2 of the residents who happened to be awake in the wee small hours of October 31st had seen a youngish-looking man running away from the convent. The reports of the murderer being somewhat young were corroborated when fingerprint analysis brought back a match, that of a 17-year-old boy named Johnny Frank Garrett, who was already known to Amarillo's Sheriff's Department given he had previously been a suspect in a burglary case. Garrett initially denied all charges, but the evidence against him was almost overwhelming. It was gathered by a unit that combined deputies from Potter and Randall counties, as well as Amarillo police. It was the first multi-agency cooperative law enforcement investigation in the history of Amarillo and led to the creation of a flagship special crimes unit. It was discovered that Garrett's fingerprints were a match to those found at the crime scene. Amarillo Police Sergeant Claude Stevens testified that fingerprints found in the room of the slain nun could, quote-unquote, not have been made by any other person than Garrett. Hairs taken from Sister Taddea's bed linens were determined to have the same individual characteristics as Garrett's. Not only that, but the steak knife found under the nun's bed was of the same manufacturer, design, and make as another steak knife recovered from Garrett's home address. However, Garrett countered that he had not been at the convent in the early hours of Halloween, but had in fact broken in a few days previously with the intention of stealing valuables. He told police that he had entered the convent not via Tadea's bedroom window, but via the front door at around noon. His route took him from the medication room to the cafeteria, which is where he claimed to have picked up the knife. Garrett then claimed that he snuck into several of the bedrooms, one of which was Sister Tadea's, which is where he found her sleeping. He said his fingerprints on the headboard of her bed could be explained by the fact that he used it to lean on whilst reaching across her bed to take an expensive-looking cross which was mounted on the wall. After he'd received the cross, he'd heard a noise at the convent, then simply fled, seeking refuge from the law in his mother's house at around 10 p.m. on October 30th, where he insisted he had remained until the following morning. At Garrett's trial for Sister Tadea's murder, one of the other nuns who resided at the St. Francis convent testified that his story was impossible. A Sister Bernice Nogler asserted that there was no way Garrett would have been able to enter the convent through its front door, since it was kept locked and only open for scheduled visitors. Not only that, but given that noontime was one of the cafeteria's busiest times of the day, there was absolutely no way that Garrett could have entered unnoticed, let alone be able to steal a steak knife undetected. She also added that Garrett's claim of bending a knife whilst prying open a locked drawer was complete nonsense. He broke into a convent, a place where theft was considered a grave sin, so there was no need for any nun to lock away her belongings, nor did they have anything to hide from each other. Sister Bernice also added that the suggestion of Sister Tadea owning any kind of valuable, gold-plated cross was utterly ridiculous. She had taken a vow of poverty, an essential part of becoming a bride of Christ, and actively eschewed such pointless trinkets in favor of true wealth, God's love. The state prosecutor also called several eyewitnesses who lived in the same neighborhood as Garrett's mother, one of whom said that they had seen Garrett stalking around the property of an elderly neighbor of theirs during a few hours before the time when Sister Tadea was murdered. Another neighbor testified that he had seen Garrett on his own property at around 11 p.m. on the 30th of October, again, just a few hours before Tadea's life was violently snuffed out. A look into Garrett's personal history provides many clues as to why he might commit an act of such pure evil. One of the psychologists who interviewed him pending his trial confirmed that he was severely mentally impaired, describing him as chronically psychotic and as having one of the most virulent histories of abuse and neglect I have ever encountered in 28 years of practice. When he was just a boy, Garrett was repeatedly assaulted by his stepfather, who also loaned him out to other child abusers to be used for their gratification. From the age of 14 onwards, he was forced to perform bizarre acts and even made to participate in the recording of certain films in which he starred with much older men. At the age of just 10 years old, he was introduced to drugs and alcohol by members of his own family and subsequently developed severe substance abuse problems, which culminated in heavy use of brain-damaging substances such as paint thinner and amphetamines. Garrett was also regularly physically abused, and on one occasion was picked up and sat upon the burner of a stove, resulting in hideous, permanent scarring to his backside and thighs. The severe physical abuse resulted in some pretty serious head injuries and brain damage, resulting in some shockingly paranoid delusions, including the belief that the lethal injection, Texas's preferred method of execution at the time, would not actually kill him. Despite such a psychological profile, that information was not shared with the jury at his trial, who were only presented with the relevant physical evidence and witness testimonies. Garrett's trial ended in September of 1982 when a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and the presiding judge found no difficulty in sentencing him to death. For the next 10 years of his life, Garrett was held at Ellis Unit, north of Huntsville, Texas, which at the time held men on the state of Texas's death row. He led a miserable existence, portrayed as an absolute monster by the media, despite his insistence that he was innocent of the crime he was convicted of. The date of his execution was set to be the 6th of January 1992, but just before he was scheduled for the lethal injection, there came an unlikely intervention from someone that caused something of a media frenzy around the world. An appeal for clemency came in from none other than the head of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II. The Pope contacted the governor of Texas at the time, a woman by the name of Ann Richards, with a deeply convincing argument for mercy. It was in his opinion that not only was it in the interest of the Catholic Church to forgive Garrett for his crimes, but it was also against Christ's teachings to take the lives of any living person, especially as a kind of revenge for a crime, wrath being one of the deadly sins. The Pope also argued that there was a considerable amount of information coming to light which suggested that Garrett was actually innocent of the crime he was accused of, and that his pleas were not just those of a guilty man afraid of his own death. In light of the phone call she received, as well as a letter campaign initiated by Catholics around the world, Governor Richards relented and granted Garrett a temporary reprieve. After Governor Richards' reprieve, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles communed to hold a hearing on whether or not Garrett should receive a commutation to merely life in prison instead of death. The 17 board members held a simple vote. When the votes were counted, it was found that not a single one of them had chosen to commute Garrett's sentence. All 17 believed he was guilty and should be executed for murdering Sister Tadea. And so, as a result of the failed vote for mercy, Johnny Frank Garrett was finally executed by lethal injection on February the 11th, 1992, at the age of 28. Local and national news sources discovered that his final meal request was ice cream, nothing more, and that he had declined to make a formal final statement regarding the murder or his supposed innocence. However, APB News claimed they had a source that was present inside the execution chamber when Garrett was let in, one who insisted that he had spontaneously said, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss it." The indecent assault and murder of a woman of God is perhaps one of the most obscene and disturbing crimes we can possibly encounter. But what is most disturbing about the case of Johnny Frank Garrett is that he might actually have been innocent of the crime, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. 22 years after jurors convicted him, and 12 years after Garrett was executed for the slaying, an Amarillo attorney attempted to prove his innocence. No reasonable mind would believe otherwise, Jesse Quackenbush said. The old and newly discovered evidence of Johnny Frank Garrett's innocence is so compelling, it will cause even the most bloodthirsty proponents of the death penalty to shake their heads in doubt. Quackenbush noted in a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles that there were links between Sister Tadea's slaying and that of 77-year-old Narnie Box Bryson, who was killed just 3 months before Sister Tadea in the same part of town and in a very similar manner. The similarities were so striking that the district attorney at the time was convinced the same man killed both women. A man by the name of Leoncio Perez Rueda remains in jail in Bryson's slaying, and Quackenbush was quick to point out that during a recent interview, Rueda described assaulting and beating a nun on Halloween night in 1981. But given the finality of the death penalty, we might never find out the truth behind Sister Tadea's slaying, and we can only assume that given the mountain of evidence against Garrett, that he was in fact guilty of the crime. But still begs the question, which is more horrifying, the murder of a nun, or the fact that we may never get to know what really happened that night? What's clear is that the only two people who really know are the poor nun that was murdered, and the vicious, predatory monster that took her life. Teresa Lynn Venegas was born on August 9, 1990. She lived in Dickinson, Texas, and had a large, loving family, which included her parents, 2 sisters, 1 brother, grandparents, and a dog named Tinkerbell. According to Teresa's sisters, that they loved doing each other's hairs and nails, all the girly things one might expect from a trio of close-knit female siblings. Both of her sisters were quoted as saying that they were each pretty envious of her long, wavy hair, but still took a lot of joy in styling it and making their younger sister look as pretty as can be. Teresa was also very close with her grandmother, Betty, who saw her home as a kind of sanctuary, a place she could escape to whenever life in her own busy family home grew too hectic. Halloween of 2006 began much like any other for Teresa, a typical Tuesday where she would head off to the nearby Dickinson High School for class and study before heading to a friend's house after school to hang out and watch scary movies. She was a good student and was a gregarious young lady, so it wasn't unusual for her to head right to her friend's place after school before returning home fairly late. But that night, Teresa was planning to meet up with a guy 3 years older than her, a 19-year-old, and has merely told her parents she was visiting a friend as cover for meeting this mystery guy. Teresa reportedly met him through a website, dopehouserecords.com, about 3 months prior to the meeting, and a subsequent investigation showed that he had traveled from Abilene in Texas, a 6-hour drive from Dickinson. Teresa had obviously been hoping for romance, but all she found was death. Her body was discovered in a shallow grave by a dirt bike rider on Friday, November 3rd, just a few hundred meters away from her high school. According to investigations into her cell phone records, Teresa reportedly met him through a website, dopehouserecords.com, about 3 months prior to the meeting, and a subsequent investigation showed that he had traveled from Abilene in Texas, about an 8-hour drive from Dickinson. Teresa had obviously been hoping for romance, but all she found was death. Her body was discovered in a shallow grave by a dirt bike rider on Friday, November 3rd, just a few hundred meters away from her high school. According to investigations into her cell phone records, Teresa reportedly called the record guy at around 10 p.m. that night, as she had told him she was having trouble finding a ride to his house. There is no information on how long that call was, but a record of her sent text messages revealed that told him that she was going to try and find a map at a convenience store. However, police subsequently located and interviewed the guy in question after naming him as the number one suspect in her murder. He denied her being in his parents' house with him, and a forensic examination discovered that he was most likely telling the truth. Not a single trace of Teresa's DNA was found in the home. Police then found multiple witnesses who stated that Teresa was in fact at a Halloween house party, specifically cited at around 11 p.m. on California Avenue. However, there is record which indicates that another witness saw her at a different party, in Bramble Lane perhaps as late as midnight. This is entirely feasible, given that the two addresses are only about a mile from each other, with Dickinson High School, where her body was found, being almost dead in the middle of the two. So despite the contradictory sightings, it's possible that Teresa could have been at both parties that evening. However, the one thing that unified the different sightings was that Teresa was spotted talking to an older man at both parties. However, it's not clear who this person was, or if it was in fact the same person present at both parties. What was clear is that Teresa didn't return home that night. The next morning, upon finding her bedroom empty, Teresa's worried parents reported her as missing. In an interview with local news stations, her grandmother said that she assumed Teresa was still with her friends, and it wasn't unusual for her to disappear for a couple of days to hang out with those friends. This prevented an initial panic for a short while, but once her body was found in a drainage ditch on an unused practice field for the high school soccer team, her family and friends were devastated. Despite not releasing many details of Teresa's death, the police made it clear that foul play was suspected. It came out later that she had been badly beaten and had somehow received cuts on her hands, but when it came to her funeral, it was a closed casket funeral. This could be down to the water damage her body endured as a result of being dumped in a drainage ditch, but it's also possible that her injuries were so gruesome that it was simply not feasible to show her body to the public. However, other sources state that Teresa's body had some of the worst signs of strangulation they'd ever seen, and that when her body was found, a belt was still tied tight around her neck. Another source revealed that almost all of Teresa's hair had been cut off, implying some kind of personal motive to the crime, or at least someone psychopathic enough to take her hair as some kind of trophy, and that she was naked from the waist down. In the days following the discovery of her corpse, and in response to an appeal by local police for any witnesses to come forward, several people reported seeing a Caucasian man with long dark hair around the high school on Halloween night. Police also found her glasses and a hair clip belonging to Teresa, not too far from the drainage ditch, concluding she had been killed in that same area following some kind of struggle. The state of her body was most definitely in line with the theory that she had been murdered where her body was found, with the killer then fleeing the scene as quickly as possible. DNA was recovered from her body, which is believed to be that of the killer, but almost exactly 15 years later, it has still not been linked to any known criminal or suspect. More than 45 people have been interviewed in relation to the case, but not a single person had been charged. Exactly 10 years to the day since her disappearance, on November 1st, 2016, the Dickinson Police Department posted on Facebook regarding her unsolved murder. The police has some interesting phrasing, saying, "There have been significant developments during that time. However, investigators are looking for additional information that would help them gather enough evidence to make an arrest and give Teresa's family closure." However, it isn't clear whether this meant that they had a new suspect and need more evidence, or that they were in the process of gathering evidence in order to officially charge a long-suspected individual. On October 29th of 2006, just a few days before Teresa disappeared, a close friend of hers named Kimberly Ramsey was reported missing by her parents. In the aftermath of Teresa's body being found, there were serious concerns that there was a significant connection between the two disappearances. Yet thankfully, Kimberly was found safe and sound on November 9th, staying with her boyfriend in Rusk, Texas. Kimberly was questioned by police regarding Teresa's murder, but this was the first she'd heard of it, and she became hysterical with grief. So it was determined that Kimberly's disappearance was merely a coincidence. It turns out that Kimberly had somewhat of a history of being a runaway, and had actually made an appearance on Dr. Phil during an episode on teenage runaways. It has also been noted that Teresa had issues with running away from home, so there is still a connection between the two girls' behavior, albeit a tenuous one. The following year, on July 15, 2007, the body of Bridget Guerin, a woman from Beaumont, was discovered on Crystal Beach. Crystal Beach is only an hour and a half's driving time from Dickinson, Texas, and is easily accessible through Galveston Island. The crime scene was eerily similar to Teresa's. Bridget was brutally beaten, strangled, and indecently assaulted, and was found dead, half naked, near a body of water. But unlike the former, Bridget was much older at 28, was Caucasian, and a legal assistant. On the other hand, Teresa was just 16, Hispanic, and a student. It is also on record that 4 suspects were linked to Bridget's murder. While we have no information about the number of suspects in Teresa's case, if indeed there were any at all. Despite there being no official law enforcement connection made between the two murders, it is plausible that the similarities in the murder mean they were committed by the same person, given that the relatively close time frame and the geographical proximity. Coincidentally, the two women also share the same middle name, Lynn. Teresa's murder is often associated with the Texas Killing Fields, a 50-mile stretch of land close to Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. The Killing Fields became infamous after 4 corpses were discovered near a 25-acre plot of land located near to the Calder oil field, which are only about 6 miles away from where Teresa's body was found. Since the 1970s, the cases of over 30 murders and disappearances of young women have been associated with this patch of land, which has been described as a serial killer's burial ground due to the area's distinct desolation. There are some who theorize that multiple serial killers are operating in the area, but few cases have been officially connected, and only one seems to match up with the timeline of Teresa. The book of 23-year-old Sarah Trusty was discovered in the Texas City Dike of July 28, 2002. Sarah was attacked 4 years before Teresa, with the dike being only 16 miles from Dickinson High School. It is entirely possible that whoever killed these girls might well be the same person that killed Teresa, but due to time constraints and dwindling evidence, it is also entirely possible that we may never, ever know who murdered the young Hispanic student, and that her murderer, and perhaps the murderer of many others, is still living free in the Dickinson area, just waiting for another chance to strike. McCamey Manor is arguably the most terrifying and controversial haunted attraction in the United States today. Yet what makes McCamey Manor so different from the others is that there are no zombies, ghosts, or werewolves to frighten visitors. Instead, members of staff are permitted to bind, gag, and push visitors to their physical and emotional limits. Obviously, it's not something the average horror fan is going to enjoy, and there are several entry requirements. Visitors must be at least 21 years of age and must pass a physical exam, a drug test, and a background check. McCamey Manor operates all year round, although interest tends to peak during the Halloween season and actually offers visitors a hefty $20,000 if they are able to survive for more than 10 hours. According to the Manor's founder, Russ McCamey, not a single visitor has ever managed to endure the full experience. The reason why the Manor is so controversial is because nobody is saying what's actually happening in here, and that's out of respect for the Manor and myself and what we're trying to produce here, he said during a recent interview. If the people who go through the haunt want to spill all the beans and say everything that happens, they certainly could, but they don't, and that makes the haters crazy because they don't know what's happening. That's why you hear all the insane rumors, because they're just making things up in their mind of what is happening. Since there is no entrance fee, the Manor is extremely selective, and just a handful of patrons are permitted to enter each weekend. McCamey also requires that his participants refrain from physically engaging with the actors or from using curse words. Breaking these rules are grounds for an immediate cessation of the tour. Based in Tennessee and Alabama, the Manor advertises itself as an audience participation event in which you will live your own horror movie. But critics have described it as a torture chamber. Even other members of the Halloween haunt industry have leveled some serious criticism at the place, branding Russ McCamey as a psychopath who's managed to find a legal loophole to satisfy an evil, sadistic streak. Upon being granted permission to enter, visitors are required to sign a 40-page waiver prior to the tour. The waiver asks that the visitors understand and agree to the fact that not only were they warned multiple times not to participate in McCamey Manor, but that it is only a game, and they are not really being tortured, although they will be roughed up and may well suffer some degree of physical injury during their visit. One particularly ominous line from the waiver states that McCamey Manor is not for the weak, but that visitors will never be held against their will. The only things off limits to the staff are explicit situations in which they might be intimate, but visitors may have their heads shaved or even their fingers broken, since mouth traps are used to inflict discomfort or pain. There are also clauses stating that dangerous heights or even poisonous animals may well be used to terrify participants. But perhaps most terrifyingly of all, the waiver states that participants may be buried alive, specifically under 12 feet of dirt, although they are promised access to a limited amount of air. But Amy Milligan, a Californian who visited McCamey Manor, insisted that her experience was more than just a game. She asserted that she suffered injuries that were way beyond cuts and bruises, and was even waterboarded by members of staff while they laughed in the face of her obvious suffering. She only left a positive review of her experience that McCamey would upload footage of her time there to their YouTube channel, which she intended to use as evidence of excessive abuse. Yet when it was uploaded, she found the worst parts had been tactically edited out. "I told them I can't do this, please let me out," she later said. "But they told me they weren't done yet. They shoved my head back in a bucket of water. I thought I was going to die in there." Another Californian, Laura Hertz Brotherton, has a similar story to Mulligan's. She too was left with more than just superficial injuries. Brotherton says that before she was allowed to participate, she was asked to prove her loyalty to McCamey Manor by completing a series of tasks, some of which included purchasing an adult onesie and filming a personal visit to a Halloween store before uploading the evidence to Facebook. According to Brotherton, she believed that McCamey was particularly hard on her after she admitted to having become involved in an extramarital affair. She insisted that, for some reason, Russ McCamey was personally offended by this. "I was waterboarded, tased, and whipped. I still have scars of everything they did to me," she later said. "I was repeatedly hit in my face. like open-handed, as hard as a man could hit a woman. Brotherton added that she was blindfolded, then held by her ankles and submerged underwater for so long that her body started involuntarily thrashing. She was later forced to dig a hole in the dirt with her bare hands, then made to lie in the fresh hole while they covered her and her face with dirt, giving her only a straw to breathe through. It was then that she repeated her safe word several times, only being freed from her live burial after having screamed it at the top of her lungs. When it was all over, Brotherton visited a hospital but refused to reveal to the hospital staff exactly who or what had caused her injuries. As is standard practice in such incidents, hospital staff called the police, but Brotherton left prior to their arrival. She later worked up the courage to report the incident to law enforcement, but was told she didn't have a case because of the waiver. Brotherton then took photographs of her injuries. In one photo, she is wearing a neck brace and hospital gown, with her face showing signs of swelling. She also had scratches on her cheeks and small cuts at the corners of her mouth from fish hooking, where a person takes their fingers and puts them inside your mouth before stretching your mouth open. Another photograph shows a large open wound on one of her knees, apparently from where McCamey's staff forced her to crawl on rough ground. According to an article written about her experiences, Russ McCamey confirmed Brotherton's story, though he did shed doubt on the severity of her injuries. Yet the article also goes on to state that some of McCamey's claims are pure fantasy, that there's no alligator, there's no quicksand, and most of all, there's no 20 grand prize for those that last longer than 10 hours. McCamey himself then posted on Facebook regarding the article, saying it was based on pure speculation and exaggerated stories. He had apparently reached out to the publication in question to offer them access to other visitors who would contradict Brotherton's assertions, but was ignored. He also claimed that he had been in touch with other extreme attractions and discovered that Brotherton had been banned by them for other salacious claims. According to McCamey, the article was an opinion piece, masquerading as a piece of investigative journalism. It was then he laid out a challenge to the journalist who wrote the piece, stating there was one simple way of her determining what was fact and fiction. Take the tour. What do you have to lose? He wrote. Do you have what it takes? But we know you'll never do that. Instead, you'll sit behind your desk in the comfort of your safe space, writing about second-hand information instead of actually seeking the truth from your own experience. Russ McCamey, a self-proclaimed cinemaphile, uploaded videos of the tours to the McCamey Manor YouTube channel, but he has since ceased to do so because of negative public reactions. Yet McCamey hasn't stopped uploading footage of the tours entirely. According to Facebook users who are members of the McCamey Manor private Facebook group, McCamey still shares video, even occasionally live-streaming some of the tours. These videos boast professional editing, lighting, and props, raising questions as to whether or not some of the tours are actually staged. One video shows a group of visitors reading the infamous waiver aloud before the camera documents them signing it. The people attempting to read the waiver aloud then have their hair pulled, get smacked in the face, and are choked with rope while trying to read. Footage later shows the individuals having their hair shaved off before being forced to eat it, and being forced to eat raw, dead animals. These acts lead some people to speculate that the video is staged, and that the participants themselves are actually members of the manor's staff. According to McCamey's Facebook post, the chance to win $20,000 is absolutely real. However, it is very suspicious that not a single visitor has ever been able to claim the prize. McCamey has stated that although the prize exists, it's impossible to attain, which is arguably the strongest evidence that it doesn't exist. Perhaps the most interesting question is how McCamey is able to fund the manor. Russ McCamey is a Navy veteran and does not profit off the manor, but was somehow able to invest $500,000 of his own money into the establishment of the manor in San Diego. According to McCamey himself, he spends almost $300 a night for an on-site EMT and around $20,000 a year on insurance. He also estimates that it costs around $500 per visitor. So just how is the manor funded? According to rumor, McCamey sells footage of the tours on the deep web, as well as taking a cut from a betting syndicate who watch the live streams from a top-secret location, somewhere in the U.S. But these contradict McCamey's claims that he doesn't profit off the manor in any shape or form. McCamey himself has admitted to money troubles after losing his job as a veterans advocate, and his only source of income is his $800 monthly retirement check. There has also been fiery debate on the legality of operating McCamey Manor. For example, the police have been called to McCamey Manor on more than one occasion, at one point arriving to find a woman locked in a basement, shivering and bruised with duct tape over her mouth. When police asked the woman if the interaction was consensual, the woman said yes, giving the cops no option other than to leave. According to the district attorney of Lawrence County, Tennessee, McCamey Manor operates well within the law, given their use of waivers. As long as McCamey participants are there voluntarily, no crime is being committed. However, a participant can withdraw consent at any time, and if staff were to disregard the withdrawal of consent, a participant would then be classified as a victim who is being held against their will. Russ McCamey also makes clear that the Manor's Tennessee location is far less physically involved than it was in San Diego, being more of a psychological experience than a physical one. There's no torture, there's nothing like that, but under hypnosis, if you make someone believe there's something really scary going on, that's just in their own mind and not reality. He stated in another Facebook post, "If you are good enough and you're able to get inside somebody's noggin, like the way that I can make folks believe whatever I want them to believe. I'm like the most straight-laced guy you could think of, but here I run this crazy haunted house, and people twist it around in their little minds. It really is a magic act, what I do. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors." However, that isn't to say people escape the manor unharmed. McCamey stands by the possibility that one may leave with cuts, bruises, or even broken bones, as stated in the waiver. In short, McCamey Manor may well be one of the greatest mysteries in the entire entertainment industry, and by the looks of things, it will remain that way, despite incredible pressure on Russ McCamey to shut the place down. People have sent me death threats, even shot at my house, and I'm not going to open it to the masses. I like keeping it a secret, he said. I like the mystery of the manor. If you saw everything, it'd be like any other haunted house. That's my goal, even when I'm dead and gone, to make sure people are still talking about McCamey Manor. And that's why nobody is really going to ever see behind the wall. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Russ is sus.